You are sitting alone at a big oak table with a pint of beer. Your neighbour has pressured you into watching his band, Midlife Highway, play at the local Thirsty Bugger Bar and Grill. The 3-hour set is a clumsy combination of fusion jazz and watered-down Chicago blues. This is not a well-rehearsed set. This is therapy. You drink as much as you can to make the time go faster. At the end of the 3-hour set, one of the wives yells out, "Encore!" and the band obliges. They go on for another half hour. You are in hell. When it's over, the band approaches you for praise. "That was something else," you stammer. "You guys couldn't have done better." And then, with your toes curling, your buttocks clenching, and a little part of your soul dying, you tell them, "Well, guys, can I be completely honest with you? That was fucking awesome." That scene should be familiar to anybody who has musical friends who grew up between the 1960s and the 1990s. Guys, usually, who had high school bands that never quite made it. Guys who came that close to being signed to a major label, they'll say. Guys who never quite felt that working a normal job was their true destiny. In short, casualties of the great rock and roll myth. The rock and roll myth is a new phenomenon. The myth began with bands like the Beatles that were self-contained units. This means that they wrote, recorded, and performed their own songs. Nothing wrong with that. However, it spawned a new way of thinking among, especially, teenage boys who would watch the movie Hard Day's Night and notice that the Beatles had a lot of fans following them around. This seemed like a grand idea. It didn't take very long for this pipe dream to become a well-accepted career choice. The myth told the boys, "Buy a beat-up guitar with your paper run money, get some faded jeans, live in a bedroom, shun all attempts by the man to make you conform, play until your fingers bleed, find some other kids who play other instruments, meet up in Jamie's garage, make an unholy racket, get a show at the local Thirsty Bugger Bar and Grill where some slick mafia-looking hustler with a cigar will approach you, shake your hands and ask you to sign to Atlantic. He will then offer an advance payment of $50,000 each. By the very next week you will have a #1 hit, and what's more, you will have lots and lots of fans, and your fans will follow you around." Mike Skinner of The Streets says in his song Stay Positive, "Keep dreaming. People who say that are blaspheming. They're doing 9 to 5 and moaning, and they don't want you succeeding when they've blown it." Now, in no way am I trying to discourage potential musical maestros, but more on them soon. I'm just trying to point out some of the pitfalls that I have observed certain bands, a lot of bands, falling into over the years. I have never had a #1 hit. I can't tell you how to get a #1 hit. Hell, I can't even tell you how to be successful. I can, however, point out some of the mistakes that I have observed bands making. Now, back to the self-contained unit, a comparatively recent invention. Up until the rock and roll revolution, singers specialized in singing, guitarists specialized in playing the guitar, and there wasn't a hell of a lot of crossover. Sometimes there were, but they were the exceptions to the rule. Blues and country are obvious exceptions to this, but they are still exceptions. And all of this comes from a long history of the orchestra. Every person in an orchestra knows his or her instrument and spends a lifetime perfecting it. They know their place in the orchestra just as another brick in the wall knows its place. This brings to mind the pre-Renaissance selfless attitude of anonymity in architecture regarding intergenerational additions by labourers to great cathedrals built over centuries from one original grand plan. The original grand planner in music has traditionally been the songwriter, the composer, as a completely separate entity to the performers. Beethoven might conduct the first few performances of his work, and Bach might play the harpsichord or the pipe organ, as the case may have been, through sometimes lack of volunteers, I've heard. But it wasn't their main job. Their main job was to compose. I can't tell you the amount of times people have told me, because people love to give advice, just like I'm giving now, that I should be able to play any one of my songs, just me and a guitar up on stage, regardless of how I have the song arranged in my head. I might have 3-part harmony, I might have a bass, I might have a keyboard. None of that matters to some people. They reckon, if the song's any fucking good, you should just be able to get up there. Who the fuck do you think you fucking are? Get up there and play the fucking song, cunt! Play the fucking song, cunt! To which I usually respond, well, I guess if using that logic, if Beethoven's Pastoral was any good, he should have been able to play the whole fucking thing with a triangle, the pretentious cunt. And yet there is a strange modern sentiment that says of current pop stars in so many words, these young kids don't even write their own songs, they're puppets. There are people behind the scenes writing all their music, playing their instruments and producing them, therefore I cannot respect them, for they are not rock and roll. Let me elaborate. The self-contained unit itself is misunderstood. The Beatles themselves negate this myth. Even though the credits on most of their songs say Lennon-McCartney, a song was either a John Lennon song or a Paul McCartney song. The other one would tweak it. John would come up to Paul with a song, and Paul would add a bass line, maybe touch up a few words here and there, or add a bit of harmony. But it was a John Lennon song, and vice versa. They weren't co-writing as such. The Beatles were self-contained insofar as they performed, recorded, and arranged their own music, and wrote it, of course. But they didn't all think with one mind, which is what the rock and roll myth tends to suggest. The myth promotes this kind of idea that the band itself is the all-encompassing zenith of musical creativity. It started a culture, a way of life, a phosphorescent goal to be striven for, a whole lot of harmless fun, and a lot of lost souls. There is nothing quite so pitiful as a former potential rock god who has refused to hang up his ego with his comb right where it belongs, far back in the depths of the closet of broken dreams. You find them at bars around the world. They'll tell you stories of their glory days when fans used to follow them around. The fact of them having to tell you this makes it patently clear that no one follows them around anymore, if ever they did. They can't let go. The rock and roll myth still gnaws at their bones. After encountering these people most of my life, I believe I have discovered some of the pitfalls which are common to a lot of these bands. What I'm about to tell you comes from direct observation. One of the first dangerous pitfalls is what they call jamming. Jamming is when a group of musical types come into possession of bongos, a conga, amplifiers, various other noise-making tools, and set about inflicting an unorganized din upon each other. A tremendous cacophony not entirely unlike constant shelling. Lots of beer and lots of marijuana are ubiquitous elements in these most masturbatory of narcissistic excesses. There is never cohesion or order in these ghastly ordeals. Everybody has their time in the limelight, including the soloing bassist, and just when things can't possibly get any more dire, out comes the harmonica. Out comes the harmonica. This type of onanism, however, is completely harmless so long as it is done privately and the hell away from polite civilization. There is nothing inherently wrong about people getting together and improvising sounds. It may even improve technique and help one think on one's feet. The error, however, is believing jamming to be a fruitful form of song practice. There is a vast gulf between the two. Real practice implies that there is something to learn, a song, a pre-written song. The practice is there merely to facilitate the performance of the song. Real practice also implies that the songwriter has done their job, whereas jamming implies that the songwriter has had a half-baked idea and wants to take it to the band so that the band can finish writing his song for him. Laziness. Jams are, contrary to rock and roll tradition, not fertile breeding grounds for good songs. Once in a while, a good song will come out of a jam session. I am willing to concede that. Sometimes a brilliant hit will come out of a jam session, but nonetheless, this is the exception that proves the rule. It would be much better for those hell-bent on jamming to show off in front of a mirror rather than to subject themselves to others. The chief benefit here is that the person in the mirror will admire the person looking into the mirror as much as the person looking into the mirror will admire the person in the mirror. Everything is consensual, no victims. There is, however, a well-tried and tested antidote to all of this. I speak here of the self-contained individual. This is the person who focuses on songwriting, learns to play all of the instruments necessary for any given song, and records them alone. This may not always be an easy task, but if a person feels himself born to play music, then this is by no means an insurmountable obstacle. Thanks to modern digital recording software, often cheap if not free, a composer can command an obedient and utterly reliable orchestra or band whose only limitation is the mind of the composer. But what about live music? Most people find backing tracks on stage to be offensive, and rightly so. The remedy is simple. While there is still the matter of organising practices, and while it will always be true that rounding up musicians is like herding cats, yet practices can be a lot more time efficient if there is a recording to copy. This concept is much like giving an orchestra a score and is the very opposite of jamming. To someone who objects, but then you're taking away the creative spirit of all the individual band members, I would object. It has always been the job of the composer to micromanage as many aspects of their piece as they possibly can. An architect is never supposed to give the order, "Build me a grand, beautiful castle." Rather, he plans the construction down to the nearest detail and has failed if the imagination of the bricklayer or the carpenter must be called upon to complete the task. It is the height of laziness and or trepidation for a songwriter to approach a band with a half-baked idea and insist the band does something good with it. This leads to endless roadblocks and arguments and has been the fall of many a garage band. Again, there are always exceptions, but the rule remains. Bands and democracy do not mix. It is not just the privilege of the songwriter to have his song heard as he intended it to be heard. It is his obligation to complete the song before he presents it to the performers. Practice time is scarce and valuable. Do not waste that time trying to finish a half-written song. Another benefit of presenting the band a recording to copy is that the songwriter doesn't have to be bossy. There's no clash of egos. The song itself is king. Now, I have to admit, I have spent many blurry hours on an evening porch enjoying the sounds of banjo pickers and fiddlers improvising. I do not wish to denigrate the activity. I merely wish to make a very clear distinction between jamming and practice. One final thought, and this is perhaps the most serious. Tire-kicking looky-loos. Tire-kicking looky-loos are the very scourge of band practice. These are the people we all know who just love to hang around when we're trying to focus on learning our songs. Why do bands put up with them? Is the band that terrified to unleash their new sound to complete strangers that they have to show their best friends first? Does the band just want some constructive criticism from their friends? This kind of constructive criticism, however, is very rarely achieved because the people who are insightful, artistically sensitive people tend to be, not always, but do often tend to be over-tactful. And the people who are willing to give you tough love and shoot from the hip and be honest, those kind of people, those brash, blunt people, quite often don't know anything at all. It's an unfortunate universal truth that honesty and insight don't necessarily mix. Blunt honesty should never be confused with knowledge. In any case, it's almost impossible to gauge how your first audience will react based on what your friends think. Sometimes a show that you've rehearsed and you've played amazingly will be met with awkward silence, and other times a completely half-baked show will be met with complete adoration. Screaming fans, or as John Lennon called them, seagulls. As for chronic pre-show nerves, I would counsel each band member to take a beer. The prescription is to take one beer as needed until symptoms no longer persist. If you are well rehearsed, then the side effects should not impair your ability to operate an instrument. The audience will be similarly medicated. The trick you'll find is to stay one beer south of the crowd. That basically means remain slightly more sober than the audience, though not so much that it's obvious. Back to tire-kicking looky-loos. There are two major types. The first type, the comparatively harmless type, just stands in the shadows, nods along, drinks all of your beer. An uncomfortable parasite that distracts the band from practice. The worst that those people do is that they expect the practice to be a show for them. They are, however, comparatively benign compared to type 2, which is positively deadly to the success of a band. Early prevention is necessary to prevent type 2. I speak here of the buffoon who, not merely content to just gawk at the band, takes it upon himself to do the absolutely unthinkable. He joins in. Now, while I oppose public flogging on principle, I am tempted to make an exception for this kind of egomaniacal, pathological asshole. If you are in a band, whether you're the songwriter or a performer or both, I genuinely wish you the best. It is a bitter struggle to forge a band. You must play in the bars, you must play in the cafes, you must play at the parties and on the end of the streets. You must never despair. You must play with the red heat of hell when the crowd has gone to ice. Know that each small show is a small step. You must guard your tools and your room. You must at all times stay sharp and quick and strengthen the banks of the creek with small bricks night after weary night, until in fate's good time comes the flood, when, well armed and hardened by long hours of struggle, your band steps forward to deliver the goods. In closing, there is hope for the victims of the great rock and roll myth. However, it takes discipline and it takes real practice. Don't jam away your potential, guys.